Hi there, my name's Stephen O'Hara, and the story I'm going to tell you now is a very familiar story to anybody who lives here in the Glens of Antrim, and you may have heard it before, but you haven't heard my account. And it's the story of how the Giant's Causeway came to be built. Now, imagine a time in Ireland when the land is populated by giants and warriors and heroes and mythical beings, and there was such a man who lived on the coastline here, and his name was Fionn MacCool. And of course Mac in Irish means the son of, so he was Fionn the son of Cumhaill, and that's who he was, and he was the leader of a band of warriors known as the Fionn, and it was the Fionn's job to protect the king. And it was a very large army for the times. Some accounts have an army of 13,000 people who followed Fionn, and Fionn was such an important person in Irish mythology that there's a whole cycle of stories dedicated just to him, and they're known as the Fionn cycle or the Fionn cycle. And anyhow, Fionn at this time, he was living there, and he, like all giants, used to go to war with each other, and they would raid each other's cattle, and they would try to take property from each other. And they liked a good fight because they wanted to prove who was the most effective warrior, and who was the strongest, and who was the bravest. So Fionn had fought most of the giants in Ireland, and mostly they left him alone. They didn't annoy him too much because they knew of his reputation. But there was a Scottish giant who had heard of the bravery of this man and the strength of Fionn MacCool, and he came one day walking across the sea, spoiling for a fight. And he made land, but as he approached, Fionn's wife was in the kitchen, and she was going about her chores, and she saw from the window of the kitchen a huge giant emerging from the sea, and she quickly called Fionn into the house, and she took him in, and she dressed him in the clothes of a baby, and she laid him in the cradle, and she went on with her work. She was baking oat cakes, and as the giant approached the house, he kicked the door open and he shouted, "Where's Fionn MacCool?" And she shrugged and she said, well, there's nobody here except for me and the baby. Come in and you're welcome, and God bless you, and I'm sure you're thirsty. Will you sit down and take a sup?" And he says, "I'm very thirsty." And he did. He sat down, and she brought in a keg of ale. I mean, a barrel as tall as a man. Barely able to put her hands around it, she hoisted it up onto the table and she put it down in front of him. And he looked at it and he said, "Oh, here, missus, are you serious? There's nobody can drink that amount of beer." And she says, Fionn drinks 2 or 3 of those in the morning before he goes out of the house. What kind of a man are you at all? And she says, "Even the baby drinks it." And she lifted the huge keg and she took it over to the cradle, and she reached it into the cradle, and 2 huge powerful arms came out of the cradle, took the keg, upended it, and all we heard was burp. And the baby had drunk the entire cask of beer. She set it down on the floor, and she had been going on meanwhile baking these oat cakes. Now, into one of the oat cakes, these were giant things, these were like 2 feet wide, and into the middle of one of them she baked an iron griddle, and the others she made normally. And she said to the Scottish giant, "Are you hungry?" And he said, "Oh God, I'm starving. I thought you were never going to ask, had I a mouth in my head." And she said, "Well, do you like oat cakes?" He says, "I will love oat cakes. Where is your husband anyway?" And she says, "He'll be back presently, don't worry about it, just you wait and I'll get you a bite to eat." And she brought over the oat cake with the iron griddle baked into it, and she reached it to the giant, and he put it up to his mouth, and he took a bite, and immediately he broke 2 teeth. There was a trickle of blood running down his cheek, and he said, "Missus, those things are inedible. Nobody could eat. What kind of food are you making here?" And she said, Sure, Fionn eats half a dozen of those every morning out to the house when he goes to his work." And she says, "Even the baby eats them." And she took one of the normal oat cakes over to the baby, and 2 huge, hairy, knuckled hands came out, and they took the oat cake, and there was just a flurry of crumbs and a burp, and the baby had scoffed the whole lot. And the giant, by this stage, he was starting to become frightened, and he stood up and he was backing away and moving towards the door, thinking maybe discretion was the better part of valour. And she said to him, "Excuse me, you wouldn't go out and turn the house for me?" And he says, "Do what?" And she says, "Just go out and lift the house and turn it round. The wind's blowing the wrong way and the fire won't draw." And he says, nobody can turn a house. What do you mean turn a house? And she says, well, if the wind's blowing the wrong way, Fionn always turns the house for me. And he says, oh, Mrs. Here, actually, do you know, I've somewhere else I have to be. And he turned and he ran towards the shore. And as he got there, Fionn jumped out of the cradle in the house and he ran out the kitchen door and into the yard. He poked his hand into the earth and he lifted up millions of tons of earth and he threw it after the retreating giant. And the pieces that fell from his hand formed the giant's causeway in several of the Scottish islands and perhaps the Isle of Man. And if you're looking at a map of Northern Ireland, look right in the centre of it and you'll see there's a very large lake called Loch Ness. It's Europe's largest inland lake, and this is where Fionn MacCool placed his hand into the earth. And that's the evidence for how the Giant's Causeway came to be built.